Okay, I think that we should be all set right now, and I will begin by thanking Professor Heldke for inviting me to this, and thank you for all coming out on a Friday afternoon to hear me talk about food and philosophy. So, the presentation today is curiously titled "Recipes as the Ultimate Meme." And I toyed with the idea of naming this recipes as the original meme, which is an idea I had once before. But I think by the end of the paper and perhaps within our time for discussion, we can sort this all out. So let me begin by saying this, that what inspired this talk is an experience that I've had as a student and continue to have as a professor. And I imagine it's one that you've all had in some way too. How do we engage with texts and ideas and arguments that no longer resonate the way they perhaps once did for others, that seem outdated, or that are even to us wrong and problematic? The good news is that our response should be similar to the way we respond to texts that do resonate with us, that are timely, and that seem correct to us and even inspire us. In both cases, we should attempt to understand the text or presentation, and in the course of that understanding, interpret and apply that experience to the development of our own critical insights. The process of learning is not merely replication and imitation, but a kind of transformation, and maybe even at times a sort of improvisation. That is, the creation of something new that was unforeseen, but not unforeseeable. So, as a philosopher, as someone who is supposedly interested in questions like truth and wisdom, I would say that my work tends to understand such goals in terms of interpretation, transformation, and improvisation, as I've already mentioned. The truth is not something that's universal and immutable in my view, but multiform and continually changing. Truth is less like something we can point to or discover out there in the world, and more like something that is cooked, transformed, and metabolized into something new, or at least the basis for something new. So we should then ask, is there a recipe for this type of thinking? And what good is a recipe if the dish always comes out a little bit different? Some of you, especially my host today, might recognize that we are on rather familiar ground, this comparison between thinking and cooking, theories and recipes. And so I encourage you all, if you haven't done so before, to check out Professor Helke's essay, Recipes for Theory Making. If nothing else, this presentation echoes and develops her pragmatic approach to thinking and her insight that, as it is with cooking, as so too it is with philosophizing, that it is necessary to explore and to experiment. This is the spirit of my presentation today, and I hope it will be the spirit of our shared conversation in the second half of our time together. So, very simply, today's recipe. In equal measure, some ingredients. I'll begin with a moment of insight. I will talk about the question that guides this inquiry and perhaps an answer or thesis to that. I will define what a recipe is, and then we'll move into a discussion of internet memes and then this strange theory of memetics, which is not without its problems. And then I want to end, if we have enough time, and if we don't, we can discuss this during our discussion time. I want to talk a little bit about Plato's dialogue, Meno, and how we might rethink that dialogue to help us with this question of recipes. And so then our cooking instructions for this dish here is I ask that you kindly listen to what I have to say, but be critical. And then you'll have time to brainstorm and to question, and then we'll all discuss. So as I promised, I want to begin with a moment of insight. So it's safe to say that recipes had a moment, especially bread recipes, during the pandemic because the environmental conditions were right for the diffusion and replication of such recipes. one of those conditions being the very act of cooking itself. There's good evidence to support this claim, but perhaps none is more convincing than the snapshot of Google searches over the span of the last 19 years. Now, what I have here is just a snapshot of the last 5 years. It was a little bit easier to visualize it, but the pattern holds. And so I just did a Google Trend search. And what I searched for was the phrase recipe for ... whatever people might fill in. And if you look at what's there on the screen in the slide presentation, you'll see that there are two peaks that seem to repeat on a relatively regular basis. And what you have there are the peaks for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And that pattern goes all the way back to the early 2000s when Google began collecting such information about its searches. The one anomaly in all of this, the massive anomaly, is what you see pointed out there by the red arrow, which is late March of 2020, the beginning of the pandemic and lockdown, when everyone began thinking, well, we're stuck inside, what can we cook? And so on the one hand, this shows us how wonderfully predictable humans are as a species and how fragile and perhaps complicated any notion of free will is. This opens up that big philosophical question. However, the insight that I want to preserve from this data point is not about human delusions or socially constructed desires for any particular recipe, but pertains to the very idea or concept of a recipe itself. Namely that for recipes, conditions and context matter. More philosophically, we might ask, what are the conditions of possibility for a recipe? The conditions that give rise to particular recipes as they change over time, and most importantly for me, as someone who likes to think about the broad questions, the conditions that give rise to the recipe form itself, the very idea of recipes, and allow it to continue to change as time, culture, technology, and media also change. So this will be a kind of duality that we'll be playing with throughout, is that we have individual recipes for different dishes and different types of food that change throughout time, but then the very form or notion of a recipe itself is something that I think over the course of human history has had a really interesting development and operates in interesting ways in our shared culture. So, does the very form of a recipe reflect the conditions that shape its and our shared survival? And if all goes well, does it also shape our own flourishing and the flourishing of recipes and their diversity and their wonderful, interesting things that they offer us? The recipe, as a cultural form of knowledge, can tell us something about the environments that have and likely will in the future shape human experience. Okay, so I'll set this up and you can hold me to this. You can hold me to the fire on this stuff. Here's my question guiding us today. What role do recipes play in the pursuit of the good life? A rather straightforward way of looking at this issue of recipes philosophically. Is there something that recipes can give to us that might help us think about and pursue this philosophical goal of human flourishing and the good life? I want to argue that the purpose of a recipe in this sort of pursuit is not the replication of a dish, even though it certainly at times does this and helps us to do this, but rather that the recipe purpose is the generation of new dishes and the transformation of any particular recipe and even the form of the recipe itself. The goal of recipes is, in a certain way, their very transcendence. And this, once again, both for individual recipes of dishes to constantly renew and push us to invent as omnivores who are interested in not only sustaining our lives, but the enjoyment of food. But also the recipe form itself slowly over time, transforming and perhaps even ultimately transcending itself. That might be something we get to during our discussion period. So these are this is what will guide us. And so I don't want to over determine in a certain way and let the recipe lead my thinking here. But perhaps what is our ultimate guide, and my guide especially, is my experience as a philosopher, but also as a reader, as a cook, and as a generally curious person. Okay, so what is a recipe? Rather quite simply, I'll say that a recipe is a means of transmitting knowledge about the preparation of a dish for the ends of gastronomy. And I have here on the slide a simple recipe, a visual recipe, one that breaks a little bit perhaps with the textual form we are familiar with. This will become important as we go along. And of course, if it's for the ends of gastronomy, we know that gastronomy is explained to us in the physiology of taste as a scientific definition of all that relates to human beings as feeding animals. The goal of gastronomy is to watch over the preservation of human beings by means of the best possible food, end quote. So gastronomy's goal is thus more than nutrition. As the indicator of gastronomy's success is ultimately pleasure. And its even further goal beyond pleasure is that complete goal of human flourishing. And this is the high bar that Brillat-Savarin sets for us in the physiology of taste, that gastronomy is a part of ultimate human flourishing, and therefore has a kind of ethical component to it. And gastronomy constitutes a rather wide-ranging science that pulls in not only the art of cooking, but also supply chains and sourcing and our interrelations with the environment and the animals that we eat and everything that's there. We could see its fingers reaching out into all sorts of places within the world that we occupy. So the knowledge transmitted by a recipe is not, as many often assume, simply a set of technical guidelines or practices. Rather, a recipe becomes a concretized event of understanding that transmits knowledge through a process that demands its interpretation as a form of knowing, its application through the cooking of the dish, and ultimately its reproduction through its continued use and its dissemination to others. But what about the transformation of a recipe, this idea that I planted in the thesis of today's discussion? Could it be that interpretation, application, and reproduction of a recipe within a new context and within a new set of conditions with slightly different ingredients or quality of ingredients makes transformation likely and makes exact replication something counter to the life and the growth of a recipe? As an insightful student once suggested, I've been told, is it really even possible ever to make the same recipe twice? Is the attempt to do that really working against what we might call, and I put this in scare quotes, the kind of natural life of a recipe? So I want to talk a little bit about recipes that are most common to us. And I think Professor Helke has seen me give this a talk about this before, or has at least looked at some of my work on this. And this has to do with the notion of what I call the modern recipe. And so when I talk about the modern recipe, modern in this context should be understood in the Western philosophical sense as the period beginning roughly around the 17th century, bearing in mind, along with this comes the rise in science, enlightenment, industrialization, the rise of nation states, and the not unproblematic centrality of the human subject in the acquisition and transmission of scientific knowledge. So my reason for using this term is critical, as the modern form of the recipe not only expresses many of the intended positive features of these movements, rationality, clarity, and universality, but also their various pathologies and excesses. The demand for precise and immediate technical knowledge conditions us to equate the term recipe, as we often use the word, as an easy fix to the world's various problems and challenges, a linear path through which the human subject, with proper ingredients and tools at its disposal, can bring about a desired end. And we can imagine that oftentimes, and this is maybe an experience that many of you have had, that the act of Googling a recipe or looking recipe for ... when the emergency arises as you're preparing a Thanksgiving dinner, or you're having friends over, or you just find yourself really hungry, is that we're not looking for, in such cases, a story. We're not looking for a moment of inquiry. We're looking for a quick fix. And this is oftentimes how the recipe operates. And so the modern recipe, I would argue, is an attempt to guarantee stability in the face of a certain type of absence. I'm sorry, I just jumped over something I should have read here. Let me say just a very quick something about the origin of the word recipe itself. What we consider the template for the modern recipe arises in medical writing and prescriptions in late 16th century Europe. A century later, the 17th century, the term recipe is first used to identify the set of directions that are used for the preparation of food. In both realms, the medical and the culinary, recipe denotes a type of practical knowledge that is to be reproduced by another, whether that other is a doctor, a pharmacist, or a cook, with the intent of the same result every time. Its etymology points to the imperative form of the Latin root recipere, to take or to receive, a command intended not for the patient of the doctor or the eater who's enjoying what the cook has prepared, but rather a command that's issued from the expert to the medical practitioner, pharmacist, doctor, or cook, as in take this or that and do this or that in order to bring about a desired result. So the reason I bring up the modern recipe is precisely because I think that it works counter to the natural life and growth of a recipe. So the modern recipe attempts to guarantee stability in the face of a certain type of absence, whether that absence is the knowledge of the doctor, the existence of a gold standard, or the expertise of the cook. The modern recipe is not simply a repository of cultural knowledge or a loose set of practices that must be demonstrated within a certain group, but primarily through its written instantiations, a knowledge delivery system or technology that values reproducibility, stability, and efficient transmission over its creative possibilities and its potential transformations. So what we see here on the right is a very quickly Googled recipe for one of my favorite dishes. And you can see that it has all the information that we need in order to hopefully reproduce this in the way that the cook or chef who made this recipe intended it to be, and perhaps even to prepare it in a way as the authentic label here helps to designate, in the way that it has been prepared for a long time, or the way that one might find it prepared in its cultural home. Okay, so if we confine ourselves to thinking about only the written text of the modern recipe, and we see it's ancient and it's also contemporary, we might say Instagrammable or TikTok forms as derivative of the way a recipe should be, some form of written text, it will be difficult to argue that the primary purpose and goal of a recipe is its own transformation, that the goal of a recipe is invention and improvisation rather than replication and imitation. What is required is a different theoretical approach to the recipe, one that challenges the notion of an authentic recipe or master text, and instead sees the recipe form as an ever-changing and responsive form that evolves in response to its environmental conditions. And so this is where I want to start to and begin thinking about memes and what it means to think about recipes within the context not only of memes, but the study of memes, what is known as memetics. And I imagine that for many of you, the image that's in my presentation right now is perhaps what you had in mind when you first thought of or encountered the title for my presentation today, that I would be talking about some of these. Now, my training is in philosophy. I am not trained in digital communications. I'm not trained in digital sociology or anthropology. So my approach to thinking about memes is one that's going to be, I would say, rooted in philosophy. So I'm not going to do an analysis of memes in terms of how they've evolved over time or what people are doing with them, although it's absolutely fascinating. I want to begin with the internet meme because the internet meme actually points us back to the way that this notion of a meme has been used outside of its internet context. So if we begin here, quite simply, an internet meme or a meme that we might see and or share on social media is a quickly spreading idea, often depicted via an image with added text, and often humorous, that spreads rapidly through the course of its and through the course of its dissemination, transforms and mutates. So here, some classics from recent, perhaps your recent internet observations. And we know that these evolve oftentimes out of, we might say, more serious or sincere posts. And so the simply jellied bread here barely constitutes a recipe. And we can take the follow me for more recipes with a bit of the irony that's there. But memes can even evolve to the point where they're not only dipping into the kind of common language of pop culture, but they even transcend the need for words as all. In a sense, the chunky soup popsicle is already implying so much of what other memes like the one above it are trying to put out there, that some recipes are just not worth making, perhaps. But what's crucial, I would say, about memes is the way that memes replicate. And if there's one notion that I want to pull out of this, because I'm not going to really, I don't have the time today to give an exhaustive philosophical analysis of how internet memes are working. But what I want to pull from this is that as much as individuals clearly have a hand in collecting and retooling and spreading memes, we know that human intervention alone is not enough to completely explain the phenomenon of internet memes. We are also dealing with a kind of material and digital culture that provides images and ideas for us. And oftentimes the ways that they're presented to us, whether those ways are by human design or they are just, the sort of vicissitudes of the digital technologies that we're using, let alone the algorithms that are feeding them to us, all of those things are acting as alternative non-human agents that are adding to the conditions and the environment for spreading those memes, but more importantly, for replicating and transforming them along the way. And I'm not suggesting that memes are operating on their own and that AI has become sentient and that now we should worry about thinking recipes. Rather, what I'm saying is human intervention alone is not enough to explain them. Now, of course, this pushes us back into the history of memes, and we learn that memes do not originate on the internet, and they don't originate in social media, but that memes originate in a certain sense, or we might say they take on their kind of replicatory and almost genetic character with Richard Dawkins' work, The Selfish Gene, in 1976, where he defines memes as a unit of cultural transmission and a self-reproducing and propagating information structure. A meme is information which propagates, persists, and has impact. And so the idea of a meme for Dawkins is one that, and this is a little bit of, you might say, debate that has surrounded scholarship on his work, is whether Dawkins himself was just using memes and memetics as an analogy to genetics and genetic evolution and genetic change over time, or if he was actually suggesting in a more ontologically robust way that units of cultural knowledge and information, in a certain sense, replicate on their own and interact with their environment in a manner that is shared with genetic material, that there is, for lack of a better term, natural selection at work here. And so in this sort of context, selection occurs when, as we know with genetic fitness, or genetic selection, there is variation, when there's replication, and when there's differential fitness to the environments that are presented. And so in the meme perspective, it is more accurate to say that any particular meme or unit of cultural information has evolved into its present form in order to encourage people, or we might say the vehicles that carry it, that encourage them to spread it in some way. And that the accuracy of a reproduction, the accuracy of that transformation over time is irrelevant for the meme's survival. Only their ability to replicate and to find new hosts is what matters. Now, I don't want to go too far afield into the study of memetics. Let me put it, memetics has a somewhat dicey and interesting history. It sort of surged into, some level of popularity through the 1990s and then quickly died out in the early 2000s. And there's good scholarship on the reasons why memetics as a field of study kind of fell away. Really, the person who probably holds the torch most strongly for memetics, at least within philosophy, is the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who works not only on these questions of ethics, but also questions related to artificial intelligence and the like. I want to put, in a certain sense, or I want to bracket out memetics. And here are the two insights that I have. And maybe these memes about recipes point us in that direction to a certain degree. That on the one hand, the survival of memes, and by this I mean not just internet memes, but I also mean cultural units of information. And I would place the recipe into this category, that if we want to take on this thought experiment and think about the recipe as a kind of meme, as a kind of unit of cultural information that gets passed along through society and through cultures and transforms over time, then the survival of memes cannot be simply attributed to inherited traits, that is, a simple replication or story about the past. This is not enough to tell us why these recipes survive and why they change over time. And nor can simple human intervention as a form of genius or will, or we might put it under the heading of the secret recipe here, that there's something more at work than just the human being willing new recipes and new creative ideas and working its environment. There is, I think, more likely a kind of reading and a kind of interpretation and a kind of responsiveness that's allowing us to take recipes, and in fact, all forms of cultural knowledge, and to transform, or to have a hand in transforming it over time, even though we're not working out of nothing, as it were, but we're merely responding and interpreting what various other forces, cultural forces, natural forces, and environmental forces are handing to us in some way. And this is really the question that memetics had tried to answer. Is there a novel replicator-based process underlying population-level dynamic that are the population level dynamic that is cultural change? Is there a kind of, if not self-replication, a kind of replication beyond human intervention that is ongoing, that we can say is to a great degree responsible for cultural change over time? Or we might say, how do we account for the evolution of cultural ideas over time? And we can throw memetics into this as well. Memetics seems to have run its course, although it has been coming back recently, I would say, not only with the study of internet memes on social media, but disciplines like economics seem to be particularly interested in the way that material forces and material culture have been shaping human practices, and particularly within marketplaces. So let me kind of sum up this penultimate section of my presentation with the question, why care about memetics at all? I think memetics, for a failed theory, and a theory that was never able to determine exactly what a meme is as a cultural unit. So it had a real tough time with ontology, which is what most of the memeticists wanted to do, especially someone like Dawkins or like Daniel Dennett. And if you want to just think about memes or cultural change in terms of human behavior, there are other disciplines that are doing a much better job at it and have much better empirical tools to do that. So what do we get out of memetics that's useful in a certain way? And some of these are partially responsible for its, you might say, failures. So the first is something that I think memetics shares with a number of movements over the last 20 or 30 years. And that is its ability to de-center the human as a strong subject within the way that we understand certain cultural phenomena. And so we can think here of the human being not simply as the grand creative chef who is inventing recipes, but rather the human is the vehicle through which recipes are transformed. So a nice parallel to this is actually Professor Helke's work that she's been doing on the gut biome and the notion of parasites, because we can certainly think of the human being as a kind of host through which this viral notion, this viral cultural notion of the recipe as meme travels and evolves over time. And the human certainly has a hand in that replication. And maybe, as my second point says here, that self-replication and mutation drive the process of differentiation, and that the human plays this kind of interesting role as the mutagen, or as one of the forces that help to drive change through replication. We learned through memetics that differential selection of cultural ideas is based heavily on context. And this is one of the ones that spells the end of memetics for many, but is a really interesting idea. And that is that unlike natural selection in biology, at the species level, the changes or mutations that occur within memetics, within memes, don't necessarily have to be beneficial to the host or the vehicle. That is, they don't have to be beneficial to humans. They merely need to be beneficial to the meme itself, to the perpetuation and survival of that meme, in this case, the recipe form, in whatever shape it might take. So these are the kinds of ideas I think that have become interesting to me when we think about recipes as memes. So I want to take two insights from this, and then I want to move to as I'm looking at time here, just to suggest a couple of things from Plato's Meno, this strange return that might be helpful to us. So the two insights we can take at this point is that the recipe appears to us as a kind of technology aimed at a human-centered desire for stability, even though the recipe form itself, unlike the modern form of the recipe, is not stable and has existed in many forms over time. And I think the meme is the kind of paradigm that allows us to view that recipe form outside of the sole intentions of our own desire for stability and survival. Secondly, when we think about recipes within the context of memes and memetics, we can liberate the recipe form from the framework of human intention and agency and view recipes as a cultural unit of information whose transformation over time is related to, but not determined by human interests or survival. That is, other contextual notions are playing a role here. So, why Plato's Meno? Why go back to this text? Well, in a certain way, it's important to note, first and foremost, that the etymology of the word meme can be traced back to Plato and the notion of mimesis or imitation. And meme is just a shortened form of the mimema, which means that thing which is imitated. For Plato, mimesis is problematic always, because as just a copy or imitation that can never be true, it never achieves the status of contemplation of the pure ideas. It never achieves the status of true knowledge. And so we learn this from Plato's famous allegory of the cave, where the images and the experiences of this physical world that we live in, cast as the shadows on the wall, are just mere copies of the true reality that we can only access with our intellect. Now, once again, I'd like to invoke the work of my host, this time her essay, Do You Know How to Cook?, where she uses an interpretation and reevaluation of Plato's claim in the dialogue Gorgias. And she suggests there, against Plato, and this is the spirit that I want to work in, that if we thought about Plato's work differently, we could actually understand that cooking can be a part of the pursuit of the good life. And this is because cooking represents this wonderful mix of headwork and handiwork, as she frames it. It's both manual and theoretical. And this, after all, is the life that we live on a daily basis. So even if we were to entertain Plato's notion that there's a life of the forms in a purely intellectual realm, we won't get anywhere close to that until we figure out how to guide our life here and now. Now, I had in mind, and I want to leave time for our discussion, I had in mind recasting Plato's Meno here. Plato's Meno is a dialogue about the nature of virtue and about human excellence. And one of the famous scenes in Plato's Meno is when Plato turns to Meno, the character he's interacting with throughout this, and shows or tries to show to Meno that anyone is capable of acquiring knowledge. And so he turns to Meno's slave and he begins to ask Meno's slave to answer questions about geometry. And of course, the slave is uneducated, and the slave is at first unable to answer Socrates' questions accurately. But with some time and with some coaching, he begins to arrive at the correct answers for those geometry problems. Now, Socrates clarifies to Meno after this episode that even though the slave has arrived at the correct answers, in a sense, he's imitating or repeating or replicating what the correct answers should be. And we've all done that, right? We've all taken that multiple choice test where we're like, not too sure. And then you put the answer down, you find out you got the answer right. And then sometime afterwards, you go to the back of the textbook and you try and figure out, okay, how How is it that this is the right answer? And hopefully over time, we come to an understanding of this. And this is what Socrates says to Meno, is that through practice and through effort and through this process of replication, through, the process of learning anything, whether it's mathematics and geometry, or it's cooking, or it's a musical instrument, there's a point where you turn a corner. And what happens is the repetition at a certain point produces something different than just repetition. It produces a kind of knowledge. It produces a kind of familiarity and fluency with whatever it is that you're trying to learn. I know for myself, and many of you have perhaps had this too, that this is oftentimes how it happens with a language as well, that you're struggling and you're actively translating in your brain. And then hopefully at a certain point that practice turns into a kind of fluency where you don't even have to think about the production of the language. And we can say that at a certain point, we have a much different knowledge of this. Or as Socrates defines it, he says that we've tied down that knowledge in a certain way. And I wonder if, maybe this could be part of our discussion, we can think about a thought experiment. What if Socrates wasn't trying to teach another individual geometry, which has clear and unchanging answers? But what happens if that demonstration were recast as teaching someone how to cook using recipes? How would this exercise unfold differently? And what would it mean in such a case for replication over time to actually produce something that's new and something that's different? So I've perhaps condensed this a little bit much at the end, but let me just conclude, because I think we're at that time, to kind of restate why I think recipes matter in this context of thinking about not only the recipes that we typically encounter as kind of strict texts, but how thinking about memes, and particularly about recipes as kind of living cultural entities on their own that replicate with the help of humans, how this might move us forward in terms of our thinking. So I think that recipes matter in a couple of different ways. Certainly for us, recipes should inspire wonder and curiosity, not only about the world of food, but the way that those recipes connect and interact with the world around them. To perform a recipe, to cook a recipe, is to always grapple with ever-changing conditions. And so we might begin to think about virtue not just simply as this idea of excellence, or a kind of balance between the appetitive soul and the intellectual soul, as the Greeks thought it, but virtue is a kind of excellence that is responsive to the ever-changing conditions around us. And particularly for those of us who are eating and trying to eat in a thoughtful way, a kind of responsiveness to the damaging effects of the recipes that we've had, and perhaps the more beneficial effects to our bodies and to the planet of recipes that we might hope to utilize in the future. Cooking should help empower us in the pursuit of the good life, not only to fuel our bodies, but to bring people together to eat and to share and to exchange. And thus, ultimately, recipes as a way of cooking should bring about transformation of our view of reality, and thus reality itself. If our reality is co-constituted by the thoughts and the ideas that we have about it, then our reality should change as we begin to cook the world, if you will. And then lastly, we might even think about thinking beyond the human. Do recipes have a life beyond us? What would it mean for other sentient beings with perhaps different bodies to think about the ways they fuel themselves, whether they're omnivores, not omnivores, or perhaps even thinking entities that don't have bodies at all. And there's so much content that's out there. I want you to think about recipes differently. I've just posted 2 of the Instagram feeds that I tend to follow because they're doing really approachable and exciting things with food, but this is just kind of scratching the surface that's out there. So I think I'm going to leave things there and allow you to discuss what I've presented, and hopefully we can continue this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Bob. And as you know, and as most of you in the room know, we are we're going to now kind of try something out, and that is I'm going to put onto Google Docs the notes that I took of Bob's talk while I was listening, so that you can sort of see what I think he was talking about, which may or may not be what he was talking about. And then you can use that as the basis for figuring out what would be an appropriate, meaty, juicy, fecund question to ask Bob on the basis of that talk and on the basis of what you're interested in. So again, I will I'll load those up to Google Docs, and Bob will just hang out there looking intelligent and Italian. I'm gonna now, yeah, so feel free to cluster yourself into some small groups. Yeah, turn to 2 or 3 or 4 people, and your goal here is to come up with a question that you think, yeah, this is a good question. This is really about what he was talking about, and it connects up with something that matters to me. So take some time, okay? And I will.
If I may, just, feel free to. I skipped over a few things for concerns of time. So by all means, ask about things that perhaps I didn't present as clearly as I could have presented, and ask really tough questions, because these are ideas that I'm working out right now. So you can actually be part of this really productive process of thinking through things out loud. I think this is what the exercise is. I should stop presenting here to
Okay, now. So I will upload these, but don't wait for me. You guys were here. So that QR code will take you to the notes of the talk, because that's how cool I am. Thank you.
These are the best cheers. I like that it has the. That's how cool I am. Still on that.